WCNC Charlotte. This is FLASHPOINT.
Thanks for joining us here on FLASHPOINT. I'm Ben Thompson. This week, finally, some steps getting made to get more affordable housing built here in Charlotte. And why this month, October, might be the best month for those Charlotte home buyers who've been scared off by those soaring prices and bidding wars. All that and a lot more coming up here on FLASHPOINT. But first, Charlotte-Mecklenburg Schools says its students have been deeply impacted by this pandemic. Superintendent Ernest Winston recently providing end-of-year results showing some big drops across the board in every subject, every grade level, and every racial group. Those numbers showing a significant disparity between white and black students. 72.5% of black third graders are not proficient in reading, as compared to 29.8% of white students. And just about 40% of black 11th graders reach an ACT benchmark score compared to 87% of their white counterparts. Joining us now is the president of the Black Political Caucus here in Charlotte, Stephanie Sneed. Stephanie, thanks for coming on. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
All right, let's talk about this disparity, because we know the pandemic impacted everybody. That's not up for debate. But we also know that specifically students of color have been disproportionately impacted. Are you comfortable? Are you pleased with the work that's being done to address specifically this issue here within Charlotte?
So the caucus's position is that more work needs to be done. You mentioned that it has disparately affected students, black students, and brown students as well, because of the pandemic. But we know that prior to the pandemic, these disparities were still there. That was pointed out through CMS' own report of the 2016-17 Breaking the Link report, specifically identifies these huge gaps between black and white students regarding the educational outcomes that, are student outcomes that are received. So this problem existed before pandemic, definitely exacerbated by the pandemic.
You've been meeting with CMS in recent weeks to talk about this, and I also know there's no easy solution here, but what do you think is part of that solution?
So part of the solution is something specific, a certain plan. The Black Political Caucus has asked for specific information of how student outcomes will be changed. They have presented an outline, a blueprint, as they call it, to change student outcomes, but it's not specific of how these student outcomes are going to change. So we may know the goals, and the goal is that we agree on is that when students leave the educational system, and as required by, as mandated, that the students are constitutionally entitled to a sound basic education, which means that all students should leave CMS college and career ready. So the question is, changes have to be made. That's the goal, but how are we going to get there? Right now, we have an outline for that, but we don't have a specific call or a specific plan for how we're going to get there. The BPC has asked for CMS to work specifically on a targeted area, the 42 lowest performing schools, which compromises 25% of the school district.
What do you think? I know you talk about goals, and I know they talked about guardrails as well in part of this presentation. And we talked about that this was an issue even before we got into the pandemic. Do you feel that the caucus, does the caucus feel like we are in a better position, say, right now than we are, say, a year ago?
No, that's an easy answer. No, like I said, we know that these disparities have been existed, even as, like I said, as identified in the 2016-17 Breaking the Link report, that these disparities still exist. I mean, just to discuss them a little bit, for example, only approximately 30% of Black students exhibit college and career readiness. Again, I said that was the goal. Every student should leave CMS college or career ready, as opposed to 70% of white students. Only, and another marker for that is that only 70% of students are not, Black students are not on task or are not proficient, not on grade level in third grade. That's huge numbers, considering that Black students comprise 40% of the school district. The other thing that you can compare is that since COVID, only 40% of 11th graders reached a benchmark score of 17 on the ACT, compared to 87.2% of white students. So we know that there are still these huge disparities that are in place. So it has not improved from the pandemic. And we also have not improved on necessarily how we're going to move the needle in that aspect. And if I could just elaborate a little bit, is that when I say that, is that we have the components. The example that I would like to use is like baking a cake, right? So you know what you need to bake a cake. You need eggs, you need flour, you need butter, right? And then, so we say, a plan has been presented to us that says, okay, we need more instructional time with the students. We need, more highly qualified teachers in the classroom. So we have the components, but we don't have of how to execute them. How many eggs do we need? How much flour do you need? How much butter do you need to bake a cake? It's the same thing. It needs to be more specific in how these things are going to change. They presented information that $50 million is going to be dedicated to the 42 lowest performing schools. But how is that $50 million going to be used? Like, this is key information that we need in order to know, are these outcomes going to change? How are we going to do that? Not that we want to do these things, but how are we going to change the outcomes, like specifically?
Specific details. Well, what are you wanting here?
So, what the number one thing is that what I always say, and I've spoken at the school board probably 3 or 4 times in recent months, this is the number one issue in Charlotte. Like, to me, education is the number one issue. So for me, it's like the caucus is sounding the alarm bell on listen. Like, I feel like I'm screaming it from the rooftops. Like, do you see that this is what's happening? We have to change these outcomes. We have to change the trajectory of these students, because we know what happens when we don't. What happens with a student in the educational system affects cities. It affects the growth of cities. It affects income gaps. It affects the ability to earn. These have lifetime and generational effects. So we have to address this issue. This has to be one of the top issues that is elevated in Charlotte. As far as I'm concerned, we should be talking about this on the news every single day until we see these changes occur.
I would argue, you said this is the number one issue in Charlotte. I think a lot of people would agree with you. I would argue that perhaps the one other issue that's equally important is affordable housing. You have a very politically powerful caucus here in Charlotte that has proven it can get things done. Our other issue on this week's Flashpoint is affordable housing. This past week, City Council announcing millions of dollars to invest in more affordable housing. Where does your group stand on that?
So that's great. We're making strides, but more needs to be done. I mean, all of these things, and it's so funny, I can tie this back to education. Like, the ability to have, to have access to housing is important. The ability to earn is important. Charlotte ranks at the bottom for economic mobility. It's not a stretch to say that connects directly to education. But yes, affordable housing is definitely on the issue, is on the radar for the caucus, and that's why we're paying attention to the 2040 plan. That is why we took a position on the 2040 plan and are eagerly and being engaged in the UDO processes that are coming up.
All right, listen, Stephanie Sneed, thanks for coming on. We do appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
All right, come back soon. More Flashpoint after this.